This podcast is on secondary data sources in political science research. Our main learning outcome is to be able to identify different types of secondary data sources that are related to social science research. Remember that secondary data are data that are collected by somebody other than you. Thus, we need good recorded information about what those data are that are contained in codebooks. What are the uses for secondary data? Well, we can use them to replicate previous studies. We can also do new analyses using survey data, experimental data, natural experiments, or non-experimental observational study. We should remember to always cite the original source of the data. There's usually a suggested citation that you can just simply copy to put in your report. But it's important to cite that original source in order to be ethical about our social science research. Why would we go about doing replication studies? Well, it's an important part of the scientific method. Replication means that we should be able to take the data and methods that are used by previous authors and in doing our own analyses come to similar conclusions. If we did not do that, then we'd have to question the scientific enterprise. New analyses can though sometimes yield different results because replication success rates are not quite 100%. And I'm going to give an example right now. For instance, there was a relatively famous article written by social scientists Lacour and Green in Science magazine in 2014. And Science magazine is a relatively famous journal that publishes peer-reviewed scientific research. It's often cited in the media. And this particular study was cited quite a bit in the media because it was a field experiment where the canvasser, or surveyor, asked subjects their opinions on gay rights. And it was an experiment in terms that the subjects were divided into a control group and a treatment group. The treatment that was used in the experimental group was that the canvasser identified themselves as in fact being gay. The findings suggested that speaking with a gay canvasser led to people changing their attitudes and being more supportive of gay rights. And this is a relatively famous finding. And as I said, it made quite a media splash when it was published back in 2014. However, two graduate students from the University of California at Berkeley sought to replicate this study because they were really interested in these conclusions. But they found that try as they may, they could not get the same results. And eventually they discovered that one of the original authors, Lacour, had falsified the data that were used in that science article. In other words, those data were just made up. There were no experimental or treatment groups, they were just made up data. Thus, the conclusions can't be based on anything real, and the journal itself, the science journal, retracted the article. This is a relatively infamous example of poor ethics in social science research, but it also suggests the real purpose for replication, to be able to essentially confirm results that are published by our fellow scientific colleagues. There'll be several slides here on where to find secondary data, and we'll start with the ANES, or the American National Election Studies. These studies have been conducted since 1952, first conducted by the University of Michigan, and then conducted by Stanford University and the National Science Foundation. And the idea behind the ANES is that every 2 years we have a comprehensive survey of American political behavior and attitudes. These surveys are very lengthy. They used to be given face-to-face. Now they are given often electronically and sometimes by face-to-face. And they have also entered fully into the computer age. You can learn a little bit more about the history and purpose of these studies in the website that is on the slide. And also, you can find out a little bit more about data access. I will say that Boise State University subscribes to a special consortium that allows you to have access to the ANES. As a general note with these secondary data sources, you always want to read the code book in order to best understand the variables that are being asked in that particular survey, because sometimes the questions change from year to year. For instance, the famous feeling thermometer that is used to judge positive or negative feelings about candidates or issues was only introduced in the ANES in 1964. Thus, prior to 1964, you're out of luck if you wanted feeling thermometers. Thus, you really do have to read the code book in order to understand the questions that are being asked. Another famous survey that's also nationwide, the ANES is a nationwide survey, relatively large survey as well, about 3,500 to 4,000 respondents, is the General Social Survey. This survey is given by the University of Chicago and does have some political science questions, but also has more general social science questions within it, hence its name. This survey is also famous. There have been books and articles published on GSS data as well as ANES data. In fact, the most famous book published out of the American National Election Studies is called The American Voter. This is arguably the most cited book in political science and certainly is the most cited book in American politics studies. To learn more about the GSS, you've got a couple of websites, the history and purpose, as well as data access, and Boise State does have special access to the GSS as well. Other survey data that are perhaps more field-specific within political science include the Comparative Study of Electoral Systems, or the CSES. This particular data set is of great interest to election scholars, or scholars of voting behavior who like to compare across countries. So this particular data repository gives a lot of information about the electoral system of countries around the world, such as when are elections, what are the typical election dates, what are the procedures for elections, what are election outcomes, how are votes counted, how are seats allocated in legislature, how are votes allocated to executives, and so forth. And you can learn more about the CSES and the websites on this particular slide. The World Values Survey is more about political culture and individual attitudes and behaviors, also mostly related to political science. The founder of the World Values Survey was a political scientist named Ronald Inglehart from the University of Michigan. And his work essentially tried to document what were called shifting values across industrialized democracies. And the shifting values that he discovered were oriented around feelings of security or feelings of self-fulfillment, often called materialist or post-materialist values. And that was a very famous finding that came from survey research. The WVS is also asked periodically, and it's asked in countries around the world, so it truly is a comparative survey. And you can learn a little bit more from the websites that are on this particular slide. As well, we have other surveys that are also politically based, so ask a lot of political science-based questions, from several countries around the world based upon region. So Africa, the Arab world, Asia, Europe, and Latin America all have their own barometers or barometros, which deal with attitudes within their particular regions. The U.S. Census has a treasure trove of data, and the U.S. Census is also used a lot in American politics research. The National Conference of State Legislatures has its own repository of state legislative data. There are library guides that university campuses librarians maintain. Boise State has its own political science library guide. These are two that also have some organized data and information about American politics, one from the University of California at San Diego and the other from Princeton University. International relations data sets tend to orient themselves around conflict and war studies. So the Correlates of War project is the most famous of these, which was started in the 1960s by the University of Michigan political scientist J. David Singer. The Correlates of War data set is the largest data set that attempts to isolate variables that are associated with the outbreak of war. The CRE Human Rights data set out of Harvard University is similarly situated as an important data set for understanding human rights practices in countries around the world. Typical comparative politics data sets involve the World Factbook, which is maintained indeed by the Central Intelligence Agency of all places. The World Factbook has authoritative information about The economy, geography, politics, history, societal demographic trends of countries around the world. The World Bank data set is collected by the World Bank. So the World Bank is not just a financier, but also a collector of data, mainly economic data, about countries around the world. The Varieties of Democracy dataset, or VDEM, is a consortium of political scientists out of Stockholm, Sweden, who are oriented around trying to measure democracy, or just how democratic a country might be. And this is one of the most ambitious efforts in order to try to measure that important variable, which is often both a dependent variable and an independent variable. There are government websites as well for countries that you may be interested in. You can search using Google. You'll just have to know a little bit more about how the country organizes data and whether or not it makes data available. So some countries that are less open or less liberal are less likely to have data that are shareable than countries that are more liberal and more open to transparency of information. There are also data repositories, websites where data sets are stored. So the Dataverse at Harvard has a lot of data sets that come from articles that are published in journals. Often replication data are linked with a particular article itself. So here's an example right there from the American Political Science Review. Authors themselves often keep replication files on their own websites. So our Professor Van Dusky Allen in our political science department has a data set um, publication as part of that website. There are other websites as well, such as ScholarWorks, that publish political science data, and the Inter-University Consortium for Political and Social Research, a mouthful, often just called ICPSR, provides a wonderful data repository in and of itself. And from it, you can gain access to things like the American National Election Studies. You can also do a Google search for data sets. That's dataset search research google.com. And that is a way to find a particular data set on a subject you might be interested in. And if you cannot access the data online, then you can contact the author of the data, and the author should be willing to give you data that are used if the data have been used in a publication. If the data are not published yet, then the author may be less likely to share the data with you until they can use the data effectively for their publication. You can usually find contact information on their university or organization website. And that concludes this particular podcast.